Hello, I hope everyone is having a fantastic day. My name is John Ludwig. I'm super excited for today's lecture. And so today we're going to be talking about creating plans. And so just a very important topic I've seen so many times, with when people play, that they don't play with a purpose, right? They don't play with plans and they play kind of aimlessly. And I struggle with that sometimes as well. It can be very easy just to play moves that are comfortable, that are easy to make, that just make sense without thinking too deeply into them, right? And so this is really I think what can take you to the next level, right? Is when you play moves that have a lot of purpose and that do a lot and that are effective. And so yeah, we're just going to be talking about that today with creating plans. And so we're going to be illustrating that today with another Capablanca game, similar to the last lecture. This time Capablanca is going to be black. And so before we jump into this game here, so when it comes to creating plans, right, you can, you have two things, right? Most plans that you create are in response to what your opponent wants to do, right? And so when you create plans, you want to do one of two things, right? You either want to prevent what your opponent wants to do, right? And so that means you try to play moves that keep your opponent from carrying out his plan, or you can try to provoke your opponent into completing his plan and to carrying it out. So that's actually an element that I think is sometimes looked over a little bit. You can sometimes see the best players of all time actually try to provoke their opponents into carrying out their plans. So where that's applicable is if your opponent's plan, what your opponent is trying to do, trying to carry out, is not effective, is actually not a good plan, and will be detrimental to their own position. Sometimes you want to provoke them right into carrying out that plan and basically make them self-destruct, their own positions. So, that's where creating plans comes into play, right? It's preventing what your opponent wants to do, right? If it's a good plan, or if your opponent's plan is not good, right? How to provoke it, right? How to make your opponent carry out his plan so that your opponent's position essentially self-destructs. And so, as far as preparing your own plan, right? It's keeping important concepts in mind, right? So if you're not just responding to your opponent's plan, right? It's very important when you're creating your own plan to think as well, right? Like, hey, do I want to gain space? Am I playing actively? What can I do to improve my worst piece, right? Different concepts like this. There's so many elements into creating your own plan, right? And so, yeah, creating your own plan is very important, but also responding to your opponent's plan, whether it's through provoking or preventing your opponent's plan. So today we're going to be looking over a really cool game. So Capablanca is black in this game. White is Janowski. This game is back in 1916. So this is 5 years before Capablanca beat Lasker and became the third world champion. So just a really awesome game here. And we really see Capablanca just demonstrate a firm understanding of, you know, basically, he's not just tied to playing generic moves, right? He understands that each move that he plays has a purpose, right? And can be effective and can really really do a lot to advance his position. So, each move that you play is important. And so Capablanca really plays with that drive. So just jumping into the game here. So Capablanca is black once again. So d4, d5, knight f6. I'm so sorry. And we have d5 here actually in this position. So just a little transposition into a Slav structure right here. And so c6, knight c3, bishop f5. And so really quickly too, keep in mind this is back from 1916, so this is over 100 years ago, which is just crazy to say. But bishop f5 nowadays is not seen as a good move, and so back then opening theory was not quite as advanced. So most people nowadays would play a normal Slav structure, whether it's semi-Slav with e6, the traditional Slav with d takes c4, maybe a Chebanenko with a6, or even something like g6. Different ways to play this off, but bishop f5 is not very good. And here, white did not exploit it. He played queen b3. If you ever face this in a game, bishop f5, and your d4 player is white, as far as how to exploit it, taking immediately on d5 is the most effective approach. After c takes, now queen b3 is very effective. The idea is now you're putting pressure on the b7 point as well as the d5 square. So really, it's kind of crazy. The best move for for black here is actually just to play bishop to c8 to protect the b7 pawn. The thing is, I mean, you can't really go queen b6 because now knight takes d5. And then if knight takes, you just go queen takes and you're just up a clean pawn, right? But if queen takes b3, you have the intermediate move, knight takes f6, and now you take back the queen and you're just once again up a pawn and just clearly better, right? Probably just winning at this point. So definitely a useful idea to know. And also, let's say, queen, d7, this allows knight e5, and then all the pieces come in. Queen c, yeah, I mean, there's really, yeah, queen c7, that just loses a pawn. I mean, there's not really a good way to protect the pawn here besides bishop c8, and that's if you have to put your bishop on f5 and then back on c8, that's not very good. So that's a good way to exploit this line. And really quick as well, if knight takes d5 instead, let's say, like in this position instead of c takes, this is not threatening at all because now you have more control of the center with e4 ideas coming up, especially now that black cannot go c takes to guard the e4 square. So actually a pretty effective move here. This looks kind of funny, but you can actually play knight to d2 here, I think, with the idea of preparing e4. There's really no way for black to prevent that. This is actually very effective. Keep in mind e4 immediately is not very good because of knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes e4, and then black would actually be the one winning. So just knight d2, just a little preemptive move, and now preparing e4 is actually very effective here. So, but yeah, jumping back into the game here. So instead, we have queen b3, and after queen b6, this is actually a very effective way. Keep in mind now c takes doesn't really work as effectively, right? Because now just queen takes b3 takes, and now either c takes or knight takes, probably knight takes, and now black has not lost a pawn, right? So Janowski missed his chance to really take advantage of Capablanca's opening. But queen b6, queen takes, a takes. So right away we have a change in pawn structure. Queens are already off the board, right? So really we have c takes, knight takes. I think Capablanca he wants to avoid taking with the c pawn and then allowing knight to b5. That might be a little unpleasant with the knight possibly coming to c7. So he just goes knight takes. After knight takes, if e4 once again, I mean this doesn't really do too much. Just knight takes c3. Once again, if b takes, bishop takes e4, black has won a pawn. If e takes, actually at this point, possibly rook takes a2 might be very effective, something like this. And the knight should be getting out okay. Maybe something like c5 would be playable, or e6 to prepare the knight coming to b4, something like that. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. Jumping back into the game, we have knight takes, and now c takes, e3. So, the structure of the position has really changed a lot. We have the queens traded. A lot of the tension in the center, that happens in the queen's gambit with the pawn on c4 has resolved. The pawns have been traded. We have, an interesting pawn structure for black here with these double pawns, double b pawns. But in compensation, black does have the open a file for his rook, right, which can be very effective. So here, knight c6, bishop d2. And so this position is approximately equal here. Queens have been traded, and once again, as compensation for the double b pawns, black does have more active rooks with the open a files. So here, this is a really interesting point in the game here, and I think 99% of players, including me, honestly, just throwing that out there, would just play e6 instinctively, right? E6, control the d5 square, bring the bishop out, just normal developing moves, right? And we would play that probably without even thinking, right? Just makes sense. But it's so interesting here because actually, too, e6 is, according to the computer, is actually a totally fine move and just as good as what Capablanca plays in the game. But Capablanca, he has a different approach. He understands, yeah, I mean, I could play e6, but he actually came up with a plan very early. Keep in mind, we're only on move 10. Queens have already been traded. We're only on move 10, but Capablanca is already like, hey, I'm thinking long term here, right? Like, what do I want to carry out? What's my plan for the position? Instead of just aimlessly developing my pieces, what can I actually do, that advances my position, right? So in this position, Capablanca plays the very interesting move, bishop d7. And this is a very, very thematic move. And this move has been talked talked a lot about for sure. Bishop d7. It's a very interesting move, right? Just going back, it looks like the bishop is a is a good piece on f5, right? It controls a lot of squares, it controls a lot of space. Talked about that last lecture. But the interesting thing is, um, the bishop on f5, while it does control a lot of squares, it doesn't really impact white's position in any way, right? It's not attacking anything. It doesn't really impact the position. White's going to put his rooks on c1 probably, and this bishop on f5 doesn't really slow that down at all. So, Kafka determined, hey, I actually like my bishop more on the d7 square than I do on the f5 square. And so in this situation, basically what Capablanca is going for is he wants to go e6, right? But this way, now that since the bishop is on d7, even though it might look a little more passive, the bishop on d7 actually is going to fight uh, for the queenside gain of space here. So basically, with this bishop on d7, it supports the b5 square once the knight is going to a5, right? So Capablanca is really basing all of his play and his plan here around the b5 square. So he's going to go e6, he's going to go knight a5, he's going to go b5, and you can't go b5 unless the bishop's on d7, right? So that's how Capablanca is thinking long term here, right? And so once the pawn's on b5, now the knight can come to c4, and now the pieces are more active. Black is gaining space on the queen side and making use of the a file. Maybe the rook can come to the c file as well. Just really taking advantage of the space that black has on the queen side. And so, the reason why Capablanca wants to play on the queen side here in this position is because, he notices he has this disadvantage, on the queen side with his pawns, but in compensation, he has the A file. So how is he going to put the A file to use, right? To, overcompensate for these lack of pawns, right? So that's why Capablanca puts his bishop on B7, so he can make these apparent weaknesses, actually, he can make them strengths as well by putting the pawn on B5 to gain more space. So just a really awesome move. I love this move, Bishop D7. I've this game has really impacted me a lot as a player, and taught me to not just play aimlessly, right? Just to think, because normally I maybe play E6 and just carry along with my day, and nothing wrong really with E6. Perhaps instead you could play E6. Bishop d6, king e7. Maybe instead of going for queenside play, maybe focusing on like f6, e5, maybe more central play. Maybe instead you could focus on like f6, g5, more maybe on the king side. But I think the way Capablanca plays this is very thematic, especially since most of the imbalances in this position are on the queen side, right? And so since the imbalances are on the queen side, right, with the open a file, the double b pawns, it makes sense to try to play on that side of the board. Where things are different, right? Where you can try to throw off your opponent. So Bishop d7, really awesome move. Getting ready to play b5. Bishop e2, and it's kind of interesting here because in contrast to Capablanca, Janowski definitely plays this game without any real plan. He just kind of develops his pieces without any care in the world, and this is definitely a dangerous trap that you can easily fall into when you're playing the game. It can be easy to get too comfortable and be like, oh, even if my opponent carries out his plan, I'll be all right. Like that is not a good way to think, right? How do we think actively? Proactively, I should say. How do we get ahead of the game, right? How do we take advantage of our opponent playing slowly, right? So I think a more appropriate move that Janowski could have played here, something like Bishop B5. This way, trying to prevent the idea of Capablanca going pawn to b5, right? Trying to put a piece there instead and trying to shut that play down. That would have been a much more effective idea. But here, Janowski just plays kind of generic moves, honestly, and he gets punished for it. Bishop b2, e6, castles. And honestly, too, like, now that the queens have been exchanged, a pair of minor pieces has been exchanged off. It might have made a lot more sense for Janowski to try to keep his king in the center of the board, right, where his king might play a little more of a role in the game, right. The king could be a very effective piece in the end game, and so maybe putting the bishop on b5, the king on e2 instead, right, would have been a little more effective. But Janowski is just kind of playing aimlessly, right. So in contrast, Capablanca continues with his plan: bishop d6. Rook c1, king e7, right? So now the rooks are connected. Capablanca, in contrast to his opponent, is keeping his king in the center because he knows his king is in the center. He knows it can be the center of the action, right? It can be very effective. And so Very, very important concept there. If your king is safe right in the center of the board and you can keep in the center, oftentimes keeping the center is the way to go. You don't have to castle always. 95% of games you'll probably castle, just because usually the king is safer. Usually queens don't get traded very early. But if the queens do get traded very early, or if the position is very locked down, you can keep your king in the center, right? Because the king can play a very important role in the action in the game. So, or sometimes the king can actually just be safer in the center of the board than on the king side or the queen side. So, king e7, bishop c3, rook c8, just improving the pieces, right? A3. Now, once again, playing aimlessly, right? Janowski has no idea what Capablanca's plan is. He's not trying to prevent it. He's not doing anything. He just plays A3, which doesn't really do anything. Like, I think a more effective move might be honestly something like King F1, trying to get the king back to where it probably should have been in the first place. Maybe something like Knight D2 to try to go E4, just something more active, more to the point, right? But A3 is just a really bad move, because it actually helps out Capablanca carry out his plan. It doesn't prevent it at all. It actually, helps it happen. So, Janowski wasn't looking out for what Capablanca was trying to do, and instead makes it actually easier for Capablanca to carry his plan. Because now with A3, after knight A5, which is the whole idea, right, to go B5 and knight C4. Now this knight A5 idea is more effective because now the B3 square has been weakened by A3. So now Janowski has to worry about knight to B3. So knight to D2. And so before carrying out with this plan, right, Capablanca plays a very effective move, right? It's always so important, and Karpov as well was just an amazing demonstration of this. It's so important, right, to think about what your opponent's move does, and to prevent it, right? So knight d2 not only prevents your knight from going to b3, but it also prepares, in regards to the e4 square, prepares a possible advance with e4. And that would be counterplay, right? Advancing the center, trying to attack the king on e7. So here Capablanca takes the time, not just to play b5 immediately, but takes the time to prevent his opponent's effective plan, right? And once again, if your opponent's plan is effective, how can we prevent it, right? If your opponent's plan is not effective, if it actually hurts his or her position, how can we provoke that plan? So Capablanca tries to prevent the effective plan by going f5, gaining space in the center and also preventing pawn to e4. So just a really awesome move. Pawn to f5, and Capablanca is not really worried about the knight coming to e5 because the knight's now caught up defending the b3 square. So e5 would only be a weakness if it could be taken advantage of, right? If it's only a weakness if it could be attacked. So g3, b5, carrying out the plan, right? f3, knight c4, boom. And so at this point, Capablanca's plan has been carried out, which is super awesome. And so, very effective. He brought in all the rooks, advanced his pawn, brought the knight in, just gained a lot of space, activated all of his pieces, which is really awesome. So here we have bishop takes c4. Basically, white took with the bishop instead of the knight because he wants the knight still to be able to control the e4 square to try to get an e4, which is what we see in the game. So b takes. And this is really awesome because now Capablanca has undoubled his pawns, and now he can use the b pawn, the other b pawn, to try to go for a quick b5, b4 advance. So very effective. E4. And so here we have king to f7. There is a distinct threat here that Janowski has of playing something like e5, forcing the bishop back, and then bishop b4 check, right? And so Capablanca's like, hey, I want to prevent that. I don't want to let this bishop on c3 become a more effective piece, right? So how do I prevent this opponent's plan? I'm just going to sidestep. And so if e5 comes, then the bishop can just slide back to e7 and still support b5 to b4, right? So here, this is really the final mistake that Janowski makes, and this is just a really, really, really bad move. But I think it's important to talk about why it's not good. So here, Janowski plays e5, which is not a good move at all. And so it's interesting. E5 looks like a pretty natural move, right? Because it gains space. We talked about space last lecture, right? Space is incredibly important. And it also makes sense too because Capablanca has the two bishops, and usually when the position is closed, right, the bishops are not as effective, right? They don't have as much range. They can't control as many squares because bishops are long range pieces. So when you close the pawn structure, you allow fewer pawn exchanges. Usually the bishops are not as effective, and then the knight can try to hop around the pawns, right? But here with e5, it actually eliminates the last bit of counterplay that white had. After e5, there's really no counterplay that white has at all. So e5 is not a good move at all. Just a concrete reason why in this particular situation e5 closing the position is not effective, even though it's against the two bishops and even though it does gain space. A more effective approach would be e takes d5, e takes, and then f4. So still gaining space, but this time now the knight can come to f3 into e5, and this would be a much more effective way to play the game. Still, I think Capablanca would try to play around the knight, maybe like king f6, you still go b5, and once the knight comes to e5, maybe like bishop e8, still trying to go for the b4 advance. But the knight on e5 would be much, much stronger than what we see in the game, right? After e5, bishop e7, now the knight has no squares. This bishop has no squares. Nothing has any squares, right? Just the pieces are very passive. And so keep in mind as well that by closing the center of the board and by eliminating any counterplay that white had, now black is free to play on not only the queen side, but also the king side as well, because the king's feeling safe, everything's closed, right? And so, yeah, just not a very good move on Janowski's part. And so Capablanca at this point is pretty much strategically winning in this position. So we have bishop e7, f4, b5. Once again, continuing the play, right? Gaining space on the queen side, preparing possible ideas of b4. And just want to emphasize as well, there's no rush to play b4, right? I know we talked about this a little bit last lesson in the lecture on space is everything, right? Sometimes it can be so tempting, like, oh, I can crash into with b4 and all this stuff. But keep in mind too, you can play b4 as black whenever you want, pretty much. This bishop is a big pawn essentially, so why be in a rush to trade off that bishop? You can trade off any time. Why be in a rush to trade off? Why not improve your position to the absolute maximum before trying to cash in, right? So b5, king f2, rook a4, king e3, rook a8. So this comes with the distinct threat of trapping the bishop actually with b4 because a takes would be impossible with the rook hanging on a1. So rook b1, getting out of the pin on the a pawn. Now h6, once again, no rush to play b4, right? So instead, Capablanca shifts his focus to the king side, right? So he's advanced and improved his position to the maximum on the king side, right? All of his pieces are over there, his pawns are advanced, all that is good. But now he's going to go for g5 as well. He's going to improve his position to the absolute maximum on both sides of the board, right? This is a really important concept as well. The idea of the principle of two weaknesses, right? And so the idea is, if one side is weak, if you make a weakness on the other side of the board as well, white or whichever color is not going to be able to defend both sides of the board. It can only just, there can only be defense on one side of the board instead of both sides of the board, right? And so, all the pieces are caught on one side of the board defending, and then suddenly you attack on the other side of the board, and the pieces don't, they can't commit to both, right? To defend both problems. So h6 followed by g5 is very effective. And keep in mind too, right? Why go g5 immediately, right? When you can instead go h6 and then g5, right? Because if g5, white might just be like, okay, I'm going to take the pawn, and then if this happens, and then just move the king maybe, right? And now suddenly your pawns are split up. Your pawn structure is ideal, but just taking the time to play h6 to go g5 so you can take back with the h pawn, right? Once again, not rushing anything. You can take your time. You have more space here. You're more aggressive. You can take the time. You can slow the game to your own pace, right? So h6, knight f3, g5, boom, active play. Knight e1. So 91 does a couple things. Janowski's idea, number one, is to provide defense to the f4 pawn with knight g2, protecting f4, but also possibly knight to c2 to put something on b4, probably the bishop, right, to try to blockade the structure. So, Capablanca knows, hey, I need to deal with this quickly because I don't want all my play stops. So he goes rook g8. He swings his pieces to the other side of the board. He's very flexible with his thinking. He's not just like, hey, he's very flexible with his planning, right, which is very important important. Never get too caught up with one plan that you're not willing to adapt another plan, right? So don't be so focused on the queen side. Oh, I can't play on the king side. I have to focus on the queen side, right? Instead, you should maybe think about it like in this situation, hey, I have more space. I have control of all the squares in the position. So I can take my time. I can try to probe and make more weaknesses in my opponent's position, right? On both sides of the board. I don't need to just focus on the queen side. I can focus on the king side as well. So rook g8, king f3, takes, and now rook back to a8. So once again, now Capablanca is like, hey, all of my opponent's pieces are on the queen side, right? Both rooks are on the queen side, the bishop's on the queen side. Now the knight is on e1, which blocks the rooks from trying to come into the game and defend the king side, right? So now that all the pieces are on the queen side, I'm gonna be flexible with my thinking, and now I'm going to attack on the king side, right? So bring all the rooks over to that side of the board. Knight g2, rook g4. Very to the point. Bring the other rook to g8, rook to g1, rook to g8. Now the knight is pinned to the rook, and now we have bishop e1. And so this is the final, like, really impactful moment in the game. So basically, what Capablanca, or sorry, Janowski, his idea as white is to play bishop to g3 to break the pin, and then to go knight to e3, right? And to try to consolidate the position, try to deal with all the threats happening on the king side. So here, this is just a really awesome concept, right? So Capablanca has improved his position to the absolute maximum. He's advanced and gained space on the queen side. He's advanced and gained space on the king side. So most of his attention is on the king side right now, right? With all the rooks bearing down here. But Capablanca wants to throw his opponent off, right? And he wants to add one final piece to the puzzle, right? When you add one final piece, that can often be the final straw that breaks the camel's back, right? And so, whenever you play chess as well, I think another important concept that I love to teach my students is, always look to improve your worst piece, right? Always look to improve your worst piece. So in this situation, because when you improve the worst piece, that can actually be the final piece that really enables you to take your attack to the next level. So here, these rooks are very active. They're improved to their maximum. The king, it's good for now, right? It doesn't want to get too active in the game because there's still quite a few pieces on the board, right? It doesn't want to put itself in any danger. This bishop, pretty open, pretty effective. The one piece that really stands out, though, that's not very good would be this bishop on d7, right? It's behind a lot of light square pawns. It's not very effective. Wouldn't it be so awesome if we can get into the game? Oh, wait, we can. b4. And just a really awesome move. Not only does this bring the last piece into the game, right, with bishop a4, and the idea is to go bishop c2 to attack the rook with tempo, and then also bring the bishop to e4. But the idea as well is that all the pieces are focused on the king side, right? So now the killing blow is going to happen on the queen side. And now, with everything coming in, with this bishop coming in, it's like, oh, white can't defend everything, right? So really, really awesome b4, just a really awesome move. Here we have a takes b4. Bishop takes really isn't a good way to solve this issue because after bishop takes, pawn takes. Funny enough, just h5 is actually just completely winning here. You could also possibly go bishop a4, but this idea is very effective because now white doesn't have his bishop on e1 guarding the h4 square. So the simple idea of just going h4, h3 is actually just completely winning. It's kind of funny. There's really no way for white to stop it. If white plays h3 himself, then you just go rook g3 and you pick up this pawn, and then you have a passed h pawn, and this pawn's weak on b4, and so you're just winning. If king to f2, once again h4, h3, and then you can attack the knight and pick off the f4 pawn. So just completely winning. So Janowski decides to keep the extra not to trade bishops, but this way to try to still guard the g3 square, so h3 maybe you can still play, and try to guard the h4 square a bit better, so this pawn advance isn't as effective. But now just bishop a4, right? So rook to a1, with the trying to get out of bishop c2, attacking the rook and coming to e4. If rook to c1, trying to prevent the bishop from coming to c2, trying to prevent what black's trying to do, this actually loses to a really cool tactic. Just rook takes f4, and the idea is if knight takes, then the rook on g1 is lost with just a completely winning endgame. But if king takes, then bishop g5 is also completely winning for black as well. And I mean, the whole structure is falling apart. These pawns are all loose. And this is still pinned, and this bishop is still coming into the game. So this is actually just completely resignable at this point. So yeah, instead we have rook a1, bishop c2, right? Continuing the plan. Bishop g3, bishop e4 check. Very effective. King f2, h5. So now the pawn is going to advance, trying to go to h4, but now we have the added addition of this bishop being so effective on the e4 square. So here, rook a7 was played. White actually goes for one final counter-attacking idea, which is kind of creative, but doesn't quite work, as this position is completely losing for white. If knight to e3, for example, simply just rook g6, and this is just going to be completely winning. The idea is, you can follow up with h4, and this is just, there's not really a good way to prevent it. White can't really play h4 himself because then you just take, and now you take this pawn, um, and that's bad. Actually, I'm thinking about, yeah. So this is actually, now I'm thinking about, that's not good because of rook a7. My bad. Basically, the idea is now you can just target this pawn, right? Uh, so yeah, whether that's bishop takes b4 initially and then coming back with the bishop to attack this pawn. I mean, this is just not good, right? With this pawn on h4 being a target, h4 coming next move. Yeah, pretty much anything coming, yeah, with bishop h4 is going to be very devastating, and the pawn coming to h4 trapping the bishop. So here instead, we have rook a7, one final counter-attacking idea. Bishop takes g2, trading off the knight. Rook takes, and now h4, and this is just a devastating pin. But white, once again, does go for one final counter-attacking play. He's like, okay, I'm going to lose a piece, but might as well try to lose it in an interesting way here. So he goes bishop takes h4. This is a really interesting idea. Trying to make use of this pin here on the king on f7. So the bishop can't just take back with check because of the pin to the king. But it's actually tricky because let's say you go here, Capablanca sees through and plays rook takes g2 check. If rook takes h4, this isn't as effective because rook takes, king takes, and now rook takes e7. And if anyone's playing for a win, it might actually be white here, since he got his piece back. If rook takes f4, similar kind of thing. You could still play something, like king to e3 or king to e1, and still trying to put pressure on this bishop. And once again, there's just a lot hanging. You can't take everything all at once. So instead, just rook takes g2 is the simplest way to deal with it. Just take the rook straight off the bat, king f3, and rook takes h2, and just be out the exchange. Bishop takes e7, rook h3 check, king f2, rook b3. And, white doesn't have any effective discovered attacks here, just because, everything's on light squares, right? Literally every piece is on light squares, so this bishop on e7 can't attack anything, which is kind of funny. So bishop g5 check, king to g6, rook to e7, and now just rook takes b2. King doesn't really matter where it goes in the game, goes to f3, but now rook to a8, with the idea that rook to a3 is actually going to be checkmate. So really, really devastating plan. And after rook takes e6, just king to h7, one final accurate move, just getting through all the checks. If rook to e7, then king to g8, once again, no more checks. Rook to a3 is going to be checkmate by force. If rook to h6, then just king to g7, keeping pressure on this rook so that bishop f6, you just take the rook. And once again, no more checks in this position. And so, let's say, the king tries to run, king g3, let's say, you just check king here, and rook to h2 is actually checkmate, which is really brutal. Just a really, really unique checkmate. You don't see checkmates like this all the time. So in this position, after king to h7, Janowski, as white, resigned here. So just a really awesome game. I really love this game, and just playing with plan, playing with purpose, right? Instead of playing kind of aimlessly in the opening, right? Nothing wrong with playing nothing wrong with playing e6 in this position, but bishop d7 is just so effective, right? Because you have the idea, hey, I see the imbalances are on the queen side, so how can I use these imbalances to my advantage, right? How can I use the a file to prepare the knight coming to a5 to c4? How can I use my double b pawns, which look like weaknesses? How can I use them to become strengths, right? To support advancing in space, going b5, supporting the knight when it comes to c4, right? So and to do that, I have to have the bishop on d7 to protect the b5 5 score, right? So playing with purpose, playing with a really strong plan in mind instead of playing just something like e6, bishop d6, castles, just generic moves, right? Instead, thinking more long term, more into the future, right? And going bishop d7 to try to prepare the plan. So yeah, I think this is just a really awesome game. This game, I know for me personally and my journey to international master had a profound impact. And so I really love this game, and I really hope y'all enjoyed this game as much as I do. And I really hope this game really helps y'all think differently about your chess and really helps you think more creatively and think more of a with a plan in mind, and just think more effectively. And so yeah, it just really hopes this helps you in your play. And so thank you so much for taking the time to watch this lecture today. I really hope y'all enjoyed it, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. Bye.